Joshua, here we go. Hello and welcome. My name is Wilrens Hornstra, and I have both the pleasure and the privilege of having been asked to accompany you on your journey through Joshua and Judges for the online SPS. Before we get started with that, just a few things about myself. I am Dutch, but I've lived in Germany ever since 1992, except for some years in Spain in between. Ever since I joined YWAM more than 30 years ago, I've had some involvement, at least, with the School of Biblical Studies and with other Bible courses in YWAM as well, which I continue to do. I'm married to Franziska, who's from Switzerland. She's mostly active in debriefing, intensive debriefing, for which we welcome people to our home at the edge of the Black Forest, the southwest of Germany. If you want to know more about us, I'd suggest have a look at the website as a starting point at wilrens.org. Other than that, let's dive into Joshua. I'm going to do something unusual. I will start with application, which is not the orthodox order in SPS. But the reason is that this seems to be the easier part in dealing with this book, at least on an individual level. Well, it certainly raises ethical questions, but many who read the book for their personal devotions take a lot away from it. And that's where we'll start. Strictly speaking, Joshua does not present itself as a handbook for leadership, or for fulfilling your destiny and calling, or for accomplishing goals and objectives. Nevertheless, we can learn much from the book related to these three topics: leadership, calling, accomplishing goals. If there is one verse or passage in Joshua that people know, it is this one, or at least part of it, Joshua 1, verse 6 to 9. And for good reasons. It's a key passage, not only for Joshua, but for all of Israel under the Old Covenant, and indeed for all of us today as well. So let's read it together. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The passage has a chiastic structure. The structure is programmatic. It points to its application. It starts with an implied promise of guaranteed conquest. This element's a bit less clear. Verse 5a, repeated in the phrase wherever you go in verse 9. Beyond this, the elements are clearer, and I mark them in color. Next, we get the promise of God's presence in verse 5 and 9. It's the essential foundation. This is what makes success or victory possible. Then we get the importance of courage quite emphatically in verse 6 and 7, and again in verse 9. Success or victory is based on obedience to the law, or more broadly, the word. It says, be careful to do. Needless to say, obedience is going to look different under the new covenant, and we have both more freedom and more responsibility to figure out what is right, what is it that God desires of us, but we are commanded to follow his ways. And this leads to success. And therefore, at the center stands meditation on his word. What the passage also shows is within the limits set by God, we have to move. He is with Joshua, as the text says, wherever you go, not where Joshua does not go. So the foundation of it all is God's promise, but there is a response expected of courage and initiative, of obedience, of putting the word central. Now, again, Joshua is not a book written to teach about leadership. We will look later at what its purpose might be. But even though this is the case, we do learn about leadership from this book. Beyond this opening passage, which is sort of a foundational charter for Joshua to live by, there's much else in this book. So here are a few more thoughts on application. Obviously, the stories in Joshua build up our faith. Then the book reminds us to remember. Throughout Joshua, memorials are set up. Remembrance, for Francisca and me, for instance, includes how our relationship got started, how we moved to Spain and back to Germany, stations on the way. It's good from time to time to think back of the things that God has done, the way he has led us. Then there's obedience. Interestingly, the Israelites get circumcised in the midst of what's essentially a war. Doesn't look very practical. But what's practical does not always get priority in Joshua. Then there's the importance of inquiring of the Lord. Think of Jericho and Ai. Inquiring is not just a matter of getting a yes or no, it's also a question of timing and how. Then there's the principle of momentum. Once it's there, make use of it. Keep going. This is chapter 10 in Joshua. Expect victory. But then let's also realize that victory is reinterpreted in the New Testament. It may look a bit different from what it looks like in Joshua. Joshua teaches us not to compromise. We readily understand the Canaanites and relationships with them as the equivalent of giving room to sin, the devil, and evil in general. I do think this is legitimate application. It's not spiritualizing or taking things out of context. For the ancient Israelites, it was very much the Canaanites and their religion that had the same place. It was much more visible and more concrete, but that's what stood behind it. This translates into the New Testament equivalent of putting off the old self and putting to death the works of the flesh. I do not think that this is far-fetched. To look at it like this is to take us to the true meaning or the true version of what the Israelites were doing in Joshua. The book empowers us to conquer our destiny and take possession of our inheritance. The land stands for our life. Inheritance, in terms of allotment of land, appears to be a type of what God has prepared for us. The New Testament indeed speaks of our inheritance in this context and in this meaning. For instance, 1 Peter 1 verse 4, Romans 8 verse 17, and again in Ephesians 1. But this is not limited to the New Testament. We already see this idea in the Old Testament. For the priests and for the Levites, this is what the law had to say. This is Deuteronomy 10 verse 9. And by the way, there's a similar statement made about the priests in Numbers 18 verse 20. Therefore, Levi has no portion or inheritance with his brothers. The Lord is his inheritance, as the Lord your God said to him. It doesn't stop there, because this principle, or this idea, is already in the Old Testament is generalized and applied to others. For instance, in Psalm 16, where it speaks the language of apportioning plots of land by casting lots, but the idea is figurative. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. Okay, one more, and then we need to move on. The boundaries of the land in Joshua 1, and therefore of the promise, are relatively clear. We also need promise. We need to know what it is God has told us. This challenges us to pursue God's goals and keeps us on track and helps us to persevere when the going gets tough. We need to know. So the obvious question is, do you know your boundaries? I once took on a leadership role as part of a base leadership team, and when things got tough, and I faced a personal crisis doing this, I remember vividly sitting down to think, what is it that God has spoken on about this? What is God's word that will help me to push through in this crisis? And I remember the terrifying realization that there was no such word. I guess I'd taken the position because I felt flattered being asked. There was no promise. God promises success in what he tells us to do, not beyond that. He sets the limits. Okay, time to move on. In the remainder of this unit, I will cover some of the basic questions related to the book. First, its name, then its author, the date, the time frame covered within the book, and its place in the larger context of the Old Testament, in that order. So first, the name of the book. Obviously, the book is named after its main human character, Joshua. The meaning of that name is Yahweh is salvation. Interestingly, in Hebrew, this name is identical with the name of Jesus. And typologically, there is a certain correspondence between Joshua in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament. They both give rest to God's people. They overcome the enemy. They ensure the inheritance. And so when we ask who the author might be, it is therefore tempting to think of Joshua. After all, he was there as a prime witness, and much later the Talmud, summing up Jewish tradition, considered him, or in other places Eleazar, the son of Aaron, who is also mentioned in the book, the author. Even though this is such an obvious guess that without supporting evidence it does not carry much weight. The book does mention that Joshua wrote something. Joshua 24, verse 25 and 26. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. However, this refers to the events of that day, the covenant renewal at the very end of Joshua's life. It says nothing about the events that fill most of the book of Joshua. A second problem with this view is some things in the book date to a later time than Joshua. This includes the reference to his own death and burial, after which it states in 24 verse 31, as you see here, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. This suggests a date of completion well beyond the lifetime of Joshua. In addition, there are references to things that are or remain until this day. For instance, Joshua 7 verse 26 and 8 verse 29. This also implies the passage of time. Well, it does say that Rahab, Joshua 6 verse 25, has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho, which might be taken to imply she was still alive when this sentence was written, and that therefore the book was completed relatively early. But it's also possible to understand this as a reference to her descendants, or as a sentence that was taken over from a source that was used. Now, there is at least one statement in the book that seems to put a limit on the time by which the book had definitely come into existence. Let's look at it. From Joshua chapter 15, but the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people of Judah could not drive out. So the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. This verse implies that David had not yet conquered the city of Jerusalem and turned it into his capital, as described in the book of Samuel. If so, it would point to a date no later than the early years of David's reign. However, there is the possibility that this statement is taken from an older source that was incorporated into the book of Joshua at a later stage. Obviously, this is something that took place because, at least in one case, we have an explicit reference to a pre-existing source used in Joshua. Joshua 10 verse 13 mentions and quotes the book of Jashar, also mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 1, but otherwise unknown. The list of conquered kings and the boundary descriptions of the allotment for each tribe in the second half of the book may also have existed as independent records before they were integrated into this book. If the quote referring to the Jebusites is also taken from a pre-existing source, then there is no way to know when the book of Joshua was put together or given its final shape. All in all, this means that we don't have much to go by in terms of authorship and date. It's quite conceivable that Joshua and his contemporaries left records and documents behind, but there's no way to tell when and how the book of Joshua, as we know it, came to be. It should also be noted that none of this precludes an early date within the first few centuries after Joshua either. We are on firmer ground when we ask when all this would have happened, although there's disagreement here as well, but at least for this there are only two options. That is, if we exclude the option that it did not happen, as some believe, because it's only supposed to be theology dressed up in the garb of fictional history. Now, excluding this and assuming that the book of Joshua at the very least offers a rough but real reflection of what happened, there really are two possible answers to the question when. They depend on the date we embrace for the Exodus, the early or the late date. I won't go into detail because this is really a topic to look at when studying the book of Exodus, but here's the short version. The early date for the Exodus is approximately 1446 BC. This date fits best with the numbers in Scripture, especially the reference in 1 Kings 6 verse 1. Let's read that verse. In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, he began to build the house of the Lord. Now, assuming the beginning of Solomon's reign was about 970 BC, 4th year 966, we end up with 1446. Give or take some years, no need to be overly accurate here. The late date places the Exodus in the first half of the 13th century BC. In this case, the Israelites entered Canaan no later than 1210 BC and probably a bit earlier. The reason it must have happened before this date is that Israel is mentioned on a famous stele left by Pharaoh Merneptah. You see it here in the photograph, which is commonly dated around that time, 1210 BC. Now, if it mentions Israel, then obviously Israel must have been in the land by then. People in favor of this late date argue that it fits better with the archaeological data, especially with when certain cities were inhabited and were destroyed. Jericho, for instance, may not have been inhabited around 1406, or at least there's no evidence for this, and a number of cities in Canaan were indeed destroyed in the late 13th century, although they were burned down. With Joshua, with the exception of Hazor, does not do. It appears to me that the archaeological data are not easily reconciled with either date. And I think there may be a good reason for this, besides the fact that the archaeological data are quite incomplete. The conquest was perhaps not quite the massive event we sometimes imagined, accompanied by a major wave of destruction. Most cities were left intact. It would be nice to be on firmer ground, but it does not matter too much for our interpretation and understanding of Joshua. More important is the timeline of events within the book. Obviously, it took Israel 40 years to get from Egypt to the land. How much time did the conquest take? There is an important indication in Joshua 14, verse 7 through 10. When the initial stage is completed and at least part of the land is divided, Caleb reminds Joshua of the promise given to him that he would receive the city of Hebron. At this point, he is 85 years old. The promise was given to him 45 years earlier, when the spies came back from the promised land. This was a bit more than 1 year after the Exodus, certainly less than 2, which leaves 6 to 7 years from the conquest as described in Joshua 1 to 12. The final 2 chapters of the book take place an indefinite number of years later, but everything in between, that is Joshua 13 to 22, appears to take place at the end of those 6 or 7 years, because in chapter 22, the 2.5 tribes from the other side of the Jordan are dismissed and return home. Okay, so we have now looked at the book's name, the question of authorship, the date, and the time frame covered within the book. What is left is its place in the larger context. If you do further study on this, you are likely to run into 2 terms, Hexateuch and Deuteronomistic history. First, Hexateuch. You may be familiar with the term Pentateuch, referring to the first 5 books of the Bible. You've probably noticed that Joshua shows many connections to the Pentateuch, especially to the book of Deuteronomy. In essence, it is its continuation. For this reason, Julius Wellhauser, the famous 19th century German biblical scholar, claimed that there was a 6-volume unit, therefore Hexateuch. Then Deuteronomistic history. A later German scholar, Martin Noth, proposed that the historical books from Joshua through Kings based their critique and evaluation of Israel on the book of Deuteronomy. This book was their standard for judgment. They therefore formed a kind of unity, often thought to include the prophet Jeremiah as well, the Deuteronomistic history. Now, the 2 terms are mutually exclusive. Joshua cannot be part of a Hexateuch and of a Deuteronomistic history at the same time. In fact, I believe both views are mistaken. First, there never was a Hexateuch. The Torah has always formed the cornerstone and foundation of Israel's faith. And second, the books that follow Deuteronomy, that is Joshua through Kings, do indeed provide continuous coverage of this period in Israel's history. Joshua connects with Deuteronomy, continues its story. Joshua and Judges even overlap a bit, covering some of the same events. Eli and Samuel are the last judges. David connects Samuel and Kings. But these books are not unified in style and form, and each has very much its own message and point of view. These books are not the work of one author or one like-minded community of authors or contributors, at least not to the extent that this can be understood as a unified multi-volume work. Besides, much of the content of Deuteronomy and of its ideas appears in other places in the Torah. It's not only the book of Deuteronomy that functions as the standard. It's not like Deuteronomy sees things differently or adds much that is new. And it's only natural that anyone in Israel writing or speaking after Moses would reach back to the Torah as the standard. Still, there is something to take away from this whole discussion. Obviously, Joshua continues the story of Israel that we've been tracing throughout, as will the books that follow it. And their foundation is not just Deuteronomy, but it is the Torah. There is a continuing story that emerges from the individual pieces, very much like a mosaic. Before I finish, here's yet another way to look at Joshua's place in the canon. In some ways, it relates to the Torah the way the book of Acts relates to the Gospels. Once the foundation is laid, it is time for action. With the law, that action is to take possession of the land. With the Gospels, it is to take the gospel of God's kingdom into all the world, which is a kind of conquest as well. But at the same time, this comparison between Joshua and Acts shows that the form and the means of conquest have changed dramatically between the two Joshuas or Jesuses.